Eucharistic theology is always centered around ritual. But as you can see here, I've got some bread and some wine, which would be the staples of the Middle East. In fact, the bread which I made this afternoon is in fact pide bread, which is a flat bread made in the Middle East, which is quite fun and is often used to show people and to give to people as they come into the house and break bread. And this is what this evening is really all about. It's about breaking bread and sharing wine. And if I move across, and you'll eventually see me, I hope, as I place myself up there. There we go. That's a bit better. And we see that this is just a reflection on what we're doing on Maundy Thursday as part of our Eucharist and everything else. When we think about it and go back to communal living in the Middle East, we know for a fact that the main part of community is hospitality. And when you come into a house in the Middle East often, and certainly in the days when Christ was around, what would happen would be that you would be offered bread as a meal, just much like this bread which I showed you earlier, and we would break bread before the beginning of the meal, which is what I did just before I sat down to supper this evening. And breaking the bread, we know how many times have we done that ourselves at functions. We're often given a roll or a piece of bread at the start of the meal, and we break that open as part of the meal, and usually we smear it with butter and everything else to enjoy it in the company of the others. As we break bread, we share in the community which is around us at the time. And in the Middle East, we don't really think about it or acknowledge it that much, but in actuality, water was often not particularly potable. So quite often wine was the thing to drink, or at least watered down wine, which gave a semblance of some purification and everything else. So wine was quite a common occurrence in meal time. We wouldn't have had the restrictions that we do today with regards to 18-year-olds and under, but really the understanding that wine was part of the meal was absolute and total. So when we come to sit down to a meal with bread and wine, this is what hospitality was all about. It was about breaking the bread in front of others, sharing with others at the time. And if we think about the Last Supper, which we do this day, on Maundy Thursday evening, as we think about that and the service that we attend on Maundy Thursday, which I recommend you looking at the diocesan site, because there's a service starting at 6:30. If we look at that, that has become a very ritualized, the communion service. Let's go back to where I was initially with regards to our home and everything else. When Christ sat down to that Last Supper, he was sitting down amongst people who were friends of his, and they would have sat down for a paschal lamb, a lamb which had been roasted with herbs and everything else, and he would have had bread there beside him, much the same as the pide bread that I had. There would have been wine there as part of the meal, and as part of the meal there would have been an offering of the food to God, making it sacred, and just prior to them eating, they would have blessed the bread and broken it and shared it amongst themselves. And in doing that, Christ was giving an indication that this was his body. A body which for us in the bread is life-giving. Bread for everybody in the Middle East is the sign of sustenance. It's the sign of life. We can't get away from the bread of life and the discourses of Christ, because this is the staple of food in many areas in the Middle East. Bread which was baked on a daily basis, bread which was broken on a daily basis, bread which was utilized in the normal running of everybody's lives. That was bread. So when bread is associated with Christ, then we're associating with Christ what is essentially life-giving. And then we come to the wine. During the various parts of the meal at this particular time, the Passover meal, the Seder meal, there are a number of occasions where the wine is brought out and is sacred in remembrance and drunk in remembrance. And the wine is also a sign of life. It is a sign of the life of the community, because it takes a community of growing vines, of plucking the grapes and making the wine. That is the essence of communal life. It is formed to bring people together. That's what the wine does. It is not a movement away and like we sometimes do today, or many of our younger generation sometimes does, and that is get overly inebriated with drink. Drink was an essential. Whether it was water or whether it was wine, it was essential for everything about hospitality, about giving of life. So the two things are intermingled here, the bread and the wine. And of course, when Christ says and broke open the bread and said, "Do this in remembrance of me," and drank the wine and said, "Do this in remembrance of me," in a way, that was precisely what he wanted. It was an understanding that in the breaking of the bread we form community. In the drinking of the wine we form community, especially when we give thanks to God for the presence of that bread and for the presence of that wine. What has happened over time, we can see at the start of Christian ministry and the start of the Christian church, the agape meal was all about the meal. It wasn't so much about the breaking of the bread and the wine. The bread was broken at the beginning of the meal. The wine was drunk at the end of the meal. It was incorporated within the meal. The meal was part and parcel of life. It was a giving of life to the community. We were there to share our resources, to share those things which some of the people there wouldn't have been able to afford necessarily. So the disjunction of the Corinthian community, where the rich were coming to have their meal before anybody else because they were different, they were more classy. But this isn't what the Christian community is about. The Christian community is about sharing and just distribution of food. And here we are distributing food and justly consuming, irrespective of who we are. Whether we're the highest or whether we're the lowest, we need to come together in that community of fellowship, of understanding, of relationship. And this is what the whole of this is about. What has happened, and I'm not detracting from it, I'm not saying that it's wrong or inconsistent. What has happened throughout the ages, we have ritualistically created what we have today in the communion service. We have created a ritual of remembrance, a ritual of coming together, as the Catholics would understand that the body and the blood were present. And for some, that is the essentiality of the whole service. For others, it is an absolute remembrance. This is what Christ did for us. This is how we remember and we understand Christ's love for us and Christ's sacrifice, making holy of the whole process of this week and moving on to the cross. But here we look at the Eucharistic meal as a meal. We look at it as a meal that is shared within the community, not as a ritual, not as a service as we understand and which we will go into at 6:30, but rather as a communal meal which is shared between friends so that we can talk about things about God, we can talk about how our lives are, we can sustain people's in their relationship, we can celebrate with them the formation of new relationship, we can celebrate the formation of new life. All of these things happen within the community, and most especially they happen around the table at a communal meal. I'm sure that although Christ initiated, as far as our theology is concerned and as far as the sacramental life that we lead today, all of this has grown out of a ritualization of the meal itself and what it means for us to break bread together. So as we go into services from now on, or whenever as we come back together, we need to remind ourselves that yes, the body of Christ is present. Yes, the blood of Christ is present. Yes, Christ is present in that sacramental time of the ritual. And yet also Christ is present when we break bread together as a community in our fellowship meals, in our meals at home with our family, because this is the extended community that is ourselves. So let us break bread together. Let us share, perhaps in a little wine. May your evening be blessed, and I hope to see you at the end of the COVID-19 disaster. The blood of Christ and the body of Christ shared in remembrance tonight.